Today I'm going to be teaching about my second lesson plan. It's about Texas' second president, Mirabeau B. Lamar. And one thing that reminds me of Lamar currently happening right now in the Texas political landscape is the idea of Texit. Now, Texit is about the separation of Texas from the United States and how many Texans want Texas to be its own nation. Now, this is very similar to Mirabeau B. Lamar, who believed in the idea that Texas wanted to be independent. Now, this is very different from Texas' first president, Sam Houston, who believed that Texas will eventually become part of the Union. Now, last time we talked about Sam Houston and how he contributed to the global rise of Texas, how it became such a independent nation and it grew. And by the time his term ended, Mirabeau B. Lamar will be elected as the second president of the United States. Now, I already mentioned it before, but Lamar is very different to Sam Houston. Lamar wanted Texas to be independent, and he did not want to join the United States. He viewed Texas as one day surpassing he viewed one day that Texas will surpass the United States or even rival the United States. And he did that by one of his policies, the expansion. He expanded the army, he expanded into westward. Now, Sam Houston, he was quite a very different man. He viewed that Texas would eventually, join the Union. He was right on that. And one key difference, as I mentioned before, Lamar was an expansionist. He wanted to grow the army. He wanted to grow more west. Houston, he did not. He viewed that the only way for Texas to survive is to enact peace with Mexico and the Native American tribes like the Comanche. Now, the Comanche are very important as they will come up later in Lamar's administration, but right now, when Sam Houston's in office, they are mostly peaceful. Houston is still negotiating peace treaties with them. Now, one thing that, going back to Lamar, as Houston wanted to downsize the army. He didn't view the army as necessary because it just didn't fit his policies and it didn't fit the idea he wanted for Texas. Lamar, on the other hand, viewed that for Texas to survive, they need a strong navy, and they needed to improve the Texas Rangers. Now, the Texas Navy were disbanded during Houston's administration. They are reforged in Lamar's administration and given a lot more bonuses and given more guns, more boats. So Lamar is spending a lot more, and that's a very key notice that will run throughout his presidency, that he will spend a lot more money than Houston. As for the Texas Rangers, he will also increase their size, and the Texas Rangers will come up again because they are used during Lamar's most infamous expansion, the Santa Fe expansion, which is a good point to start up again. And the Santa Fe expansion was pretty much Lamar's attempt to expand Texas's border more western and conquer Santa Fe, which at this time was still part of Mexico. Now, if you just look at a map today, you'll know Santa Fe is in New Mexico, Texas is just Texas. So ultimately, using common sense, you could tell that the expansion didn't fail. They didn't even make it to Santa Fe, the Texas Rangers. They got stopped and they were forcibly, the residents of Santa Fe were forcibly rebelling these Texas Rangers, and most of the fighting wasn't even in Santa Fe. Now, I think this is also a good point to mention Lamar's attitude towards the Mexicans and the Native Americans. He did not like them. There was a lot of racism going on, especially Lamar's administration. He did not like them at all. He went actively to target them, and as we saw in the Santa Fe expedition, he went directly after the Mexicans. And of course, the Mexicans aren't the only ones left out. Of course, there are the Native Americans, especially the Comanche. The Comanche, during one of the most infamous events in Texas history, it happened during the Lamar's administration, which would be the courthouse fight. The courthouse fight was a group of Texans who misled some Comanches into like a peace negotiation, and ultimately it would end in bloodshed as these Texans would corner and pretty much murder these Comanches, which was sued off a chain of events as Comanche attacks pretty much raid over Texas and becoming an overall bloodshed. Now, as I already shared some events between Lamar and Houston, I want to bring up the question: how are they different? What are some of the key events that make them different? And how can you even, begin to describe Lamar's and Houston's differences? And some might even say, what are their similarities? Personally, I don't think they share too much similarities. I think they're more different people. They're more individualistic and quite radically different to one another. So there are definitely some similarities, but most of them are differences. And speaking about the two events, as I mentioned, the courthouse fight and the Santa Fe expedition, what can you even tell me about how could you generalize those two events into Texans' attitudes at the time? What did you see, just by basing off those two events, what do you see Texans' attitudes, reaction to those events being like? And it's quite a, telling time, because as over time, Lamar will eventually lose the election, resulting in Sam Houston, becoming the third president of the Republic of Texas. And, that's a whole different story from another time. But I just want to thank you for enjoying this lecture.